She had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to what he was saying. But Martha was distracted by her many tasks. So she came to him and asked, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her then to help me." But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
I want to take a moment. Well, grace and peace to you all in the name of Jesus Christ. As we were talking just a little bit together up here, I alluded to the story about my family and the cultural expectations in my family that come along with hosting and offering hospitality to other people. Because oftentimes it's how we share hospitality that exposes some of those cultural expectations that we bring with us. In my family, anytime we would gather for a meal, and this is in my mom's side of the family, it was always the women who would gather in the kitchen to prepare a meal. Is that true for other people's families when you gather? Right? So that's not just my family's expectation, but that's likely cultural expectations that exist broadly in our culture. And the other expectation that exists is that all of us that identified as boys or men, we were expected to stay out of the kitchen. And if we came in to ask when dinner was going to be ready, or whether we could get a little something extra to eat before it was ready, or if it was late, what's happening, we were shushed right out of that kitchen. Right? Likely because there was a little bit of stress and a little bit of worry about pulling all of the things together and making sure that the meal was ready for everyone to enjoy. I want to take just a moment, and I want you to look for a neighbor right around you. And I want to take just 2 minutes for you to share what is a cultural expectation that existed in your family of origin around offering hospitality or preparing for a meal. What were some of the expectations that you experienced when you got together? Take 2 minutes, turn to a neighbor, move around a little bit if you need to make sure everybody has somebody to talk to. Let's take 2 minutes. Share an expectation in your family of origin around offering hospitality or sharing a meal. For all of you that shared an experience from your family of origin growing up, for how many of you was there an expectation in your families that caused some manner of worry or distraction within your family system whenever you would gather for a meal? All right, so there's hands going up in different places around the room. Were you all able to identify maybe what some cultural expectations were in your family as you think about what it looked like to gather around for a meal? Yeah. That's the heart of this story of Mary and Martha and Jesus today. This is not a personality test story. Oftentimes we turn this Mary and Martha story into, well, are you more of a Mary or are you more of a Martha? That's not really what's at the crux of this story. The crux of this story is about cultural expectation and how it is that Jesus breaks down cultural expectation, inviting us into a whole different experience. This past week I was reading a piece from a pastor in the ELCA named Naveen Saras. Naveen Saras is a pastor in Wisconsin, but she is Palestinian by origin. And she reflected in her commentary on this passage around what the cultural expectations were for her family, who is Palestinian now, and also what the first century expectations would have been in the region of Palestine where this story takes place. And very much so, like I identified in my story, the context around this story is that women would have always been expected to be the ones offering the hospitality and preparing the meal whenever there were guests entering the home. They would not come out of the kitchen. They would not engage with the men in the household at all until that meal was entirely ready and was perfect. Because anything less than perfection in terms of offering hospitality to guests, especially male guests, would be a dishonoring feature of that meal. And so, already, in the very beginning of this story, there is a radical moment that breaks down a cultural expectation of the time before we even get to Martha. And that's the fact that Mary herself sat herself, or was invited in perhaps by Jesus, to sit at his feet. That's a cultural term. To sit at Jesus' feet, to listen, is to identify Mary not as a hostess, not as somebody offering hospitality, but as a disciple or student. And in that time period, in that region, disciples of rabbis were not women. They were not lifted up that way. And so already in the gospel, there is this radical moment of cultural expectation being broken in the fact that there was a woman sitting at Jesus' feet as a disciple or student while a meal was being prepared in the household that that woman was likely responsible for together with her sister. It's a radical act that happens there in that moment. But it's there that we even proceed to another piece of this story that's really important, which is Martha's expectations. Because that's the pressure that exists on Martha in this story. This is not just resentment towards a sister that she's not helping. This is the full weight of the cultural expectations on Martha's shoulders, feeling like she's now the only one responsible so that she does not dishonor Jesus or any of the other guests in the household. Have you ever felt a moment in your life where you feel like the burden is fully on you to make sure that nothing falls apart? The nervous laughter tells me all I need to know. We oftentimes know that feeling and that weight of the cultural expectation we carry with us to present ourselves a certain way or to make sure what we are responsible for honors the people that we are offering it to. And so what normatively happens when we get so burdened with expectation that's on our shoulders? I think Martha is a prime example of this. We oftentimes begin to project out our worry. And that's what's happening here, is Martha, out of her worry and her distraction, out of that stress on her shoulders, projects that out upon Mary. And it says to Jesus, shouldn't she be in here helping? Shouldn't you send her back in? And it's there that Jesus offers a different response to Martha. Now it's here I want to be clear. Oftentimes we read this passage as Jesus critiquing Martha, of Jesus calling her out for her behavior. But I want us to read this passage slightly differently, in that this is not so much a critique of Martha, but it is an invitation. Because ultimately, through all of Jesus' ministry, Jesus is not one to critique or to shame people. Jesus is one, through his language, through how he holds people accountable, to invite them in to a better way. Not to shame them in what they're doing, but to invite them into a way of doing something differently. And that's what Jesus does here for Martha. Jesus invites Martha to let go of the worry and the distractions. And through letting go of the worry and distractions, to let go of the cultural expectations that are at play causing that worry and distraction. And to just simply come and be present. To sit with Mary in the presence of Jesus, to be fully present to that relationship and to that moment without letting the expectations or the worry or the distractions be a barrier or get in the way. And that is the invitation are called to let go of? What is the worry and the distractions that keep us from being fully present to God and fully present to one another as we gather? On a Sunday morning such as this, I oftentimes bring quite a bit of internalized worry and anxiety with me to worship. To be fully honest, there is a lot that we worry about in our life together. I see Troy nodding his head back there in agreement as somebody responsible for slides and music and all the things happening around. Likewise, all of us bring our own expectations to this place of how it is that we think things should operate, about how it is that we are called to be church and offer hospitality to people that come in our doors. And I'll tell you, one of the biggest pieces of life together here in the church these days, not just for resurrection, but for churches throughout our country and culture, is the feeling like we just don't have enough help. We feel like we need to do something to a certain standard, and so we get really worried and anxious and saying we don't feel like we have enough to be able to do what we're supposed to be doing. Well, today I think the gospel meets us precisely in that place. To be able to say what we have is enough. What we have is enough. Because what we have is a gracious and generous and loving God that meets us here in and through relationship, that invites us to be fully attentive and welcoming of that gracious presence, that in and through the death and the resurrection of Christ to recognize that what truly matters, what's most important, is not our expectations of what should be, but being fully present here and now. And when we're able, through the grace and love of Christ, to let go of those expectations, to let go of those worries and distractions that keep us from being fully present, so that we end up being able to be fully present to one another. Rather than being worried about what other people are doing or leveling judgments or expectations on other people, we can truly just show up to see people as they are. To offer that form of radical hospitality that isn't about the food, it's not about the place, it's about the presence. Of being able to sit and to listen, to hear someone's story, and to offer them the accompaniment and support that they may need at any given time. This is the beauty of the gospel today. I pray that it may be a gospel that lets us just shed a little bit of that weight off of our shoulders, and together with Mary and Martha, be fully present to Jesus, the eternal presence of God, and to God's presence